Hi, welcome back to the second video on setting up always-on lab in Microsoft SQL Server 2025. In the previous video, we configured the Active Directory, and in this video, we're going to be configuring the SQL nodes and creating a cluster. If you haven't watched the previous video, I highly recommend you do that because that is a foundation for what we're going to be doing next in terms of networking and things like that. So it would be useful to know. So I now have an account, I have an Active Directory. And the next step is to start setting up and configuring the SQL instances. So once again, I'll go ahead, click New, choose Custom, choose version 17. I'll install the operating system later. The reason I'm installing the operating system later, by the way, is because there is a bug over here which doesn't allow you to install it as you are creating the virtual machine. So you create the virtual machine and then you add the operating system later on. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Choose Windows. I'm going to call this guy SQL A and relocate him to my virtual directory. So just give me a second over here. Right, so USB virtual machines SQL A. Right. Push next. Use secure boot. Definitely a good idea. Now the SQL instance obviously needs a lot more processing power, so I'm just going to go ahead and do 4 cores compared to the 2 that I had done previously for the Active Directory. I'm going to leave the memory at the recommended for now. If I feel there is an issue, I can easily just upgrade it, or maybe just to speed up the installation process, I might just go ahead and do it this way. Yeah. Cool. So let's leave everything else as it is. Same defaults, like I mentioned earlier, we just stick with the defaults. And here 60 might be a little less. I would probably prefer 70 just in case I need to try out a number of stuff on the SQL instance later on. And there we go. So I'm creating, so you can see here in this case, I've got my SQL instance, SQL A, and I've got my Active Directory. Active Directory is already running, but SQL A is what I'm powering on right now. And as I power it on, I will repeat the same steps as before, where I will choose the CD-ROM, go into settings, connect it, change the file path, and choose this is already correct, and then restart it. And just like last time, I'm just going to go ahead and finish installing the operating system. You've already seen this step before, so I'm pausing the video here, and I'll get back to you once the desktop is up and running. Right, so the Windows operating system has been installed. The next thing we need to do is set this up for installation of SQL Server. And the first thing we need to do is add this particular computer into the domain. So what we're going to do is, again, as a best practice, I believe that you assign static IP addresses to SQL Server nodes, just so that after a restart you don't get some random new IP address and then that messes up with configuration of other things like listener, etc. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead, click properties, and we're going to go into TCP/IP protocol. And if I remember, we did 10.0.0.1, so I'm going to make this 10.0.0.2, right? And here, if you remember from the Active Directory configuration, we had used 127.0.0.1, which is the loopback IP address, but this guy inherits his domain name server configuration from the Active Directory. So we put in the Active Directory's IP address, which is 10.0.0.1. Right, so this guy inherits, or basically gets, information about who's supposed to log in, etc., from the Active Directory. Right, so I'm just logging into the Active Directory to show you the IP address of the Active Directory. Just a second. 10.0.0.1. So this guy gets it from loopback. He points back to himself. This is his IP address, which is basically nothing but the Active Directory's IP address. And then the Active Directory is the parent, sort of, for the SQL instance. Right, so there we go. Done, 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 and done. Right. The next thing we want to do is, like before, we want to rename the instance, etc. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to call this guy SQL A. Yeah, I'll restart now, and then I will add this particular SQL Server node into the domain. Right, so we've gone ahead and assigned a static IP address. We've changed the name, and now this particular SQL Server node is supposed to be added into the Active Directory, so that we have this kind of ability to distinguish between all the computers on our network. I did forget to install the VMware tools, so I'll go ahead and do that as well, and then restart everything in one go. So just give it a second while it boots back up to the desktop. Next, etc. And while that's happening, I'm going to go ahead and add this machine to the domain. Right, so again, I'm going to my computer, going to properties, and in properties, if you see here, you've got these advanced properties, right, advanced system settings. So when you click on that, under computer name, you'll have this option that says, do you want to change this to belong to something else other than a work group? So I'm going to click, yeah, I want to change it, and I'm going to say I want to bring it into a domain. And the name of my domain, if you look over here, just a second, I'm in my Active Directory right now. Right, just a second. So this is the name of my domain, SQL2025lab.com. So that's what I need to be typing in over here, SQL2025lab.com. Right, and if you remember, we had created an account previously that allows us to go ahead and add users to the domain, etc. So we can use that one, or we can just use the default administrator account, which is already available. Right, so normally when you install a cluster, you give SQL Server the permission to add that particular domain to the cluster, but in this case I'm just going to use the administrator account because I already have that. And if you wait for a minute, you'll see there's a message that says welcome to SQL2025lab.com. right, so that's basically just confirming that this machine is now part of the domain controller. Right, so if I restart this now, and if I come over here into Active Directory, right, and if I navigate to computers, under computers, you can see SQL A is present. And what I'm going to do is repeat the exact same process all over again to set up and configure another node, which will be called SQL B. And A will be the primary, B will be the secondary, and with that I will then be able to start working on SQL Server 2025. So the next step is for me to configure SQL B node, and once both of these nodes are available, I'm going to be installing Windows failover cluster services on these nodes. Right, so I'm going to pause the video, set up SQL B as well, and when I come back, we're going to go ahead and install Windows failover cluster on both of these nodes and set up a cluster. Now, one important thing that you want to keep in mind when we're doing this is because of cluster services running on Hyper-V, or basically on virtualized environment, Microsoft has done some kind of weird stuff there where it doesn't recognize VMware virtual machines, it only recognizes Hyper-V virtual machines, and you need to update the Windows operating system to download the patch for that particular bug. So what I'm going to do is, again, I've got this guy up and running. So while I am setting up the SQL Server B node, I will just go ahead and finish installing Windows updates on SQL A. And as part of the cumulative update for Windows, the patch that I'm looking for will automatically have been downloaded and installed. Right, so this is just a quirk of having to use VMware, and because Windows wants to check for certain things as part of compatibility, it doesn't detect VMware initially, but that's just a bug. If you update Windows, it will work fine. So let me go ahead and anyway do this and get back to you when SQL B node is up and running. Doesn't detect VMware initially, but that's just a bug. If you update Windows, it will work fine. So let me go ahead and anyway do this and get back to you when SQL B node is up and running. Right, so SQL B is pretty much installed. I'm installing the updates, and while that's happening, I figured I can do some stuff in parallel. So I am going to click on Manage, Add Roles, press Next, and start installing Windows Failover Cluster. Right, so this is now on SQL A node. So you can see here it's part of the domain, etc. Stuff that we've already done before. Just give it a second. And in this particular stage, what we're going to do is simply add the failover clustering services feature on SQL A. Obviously, we will need to do this on SQL B as well. As I mentioned previously, the important thing is to make sure that your Windows updates are completed because of the bug where failover cluster doesn't recognize virtual machines created in Hyper-V. And that's basically because a validation check will fail, saying that, you know, some particular service that it needed wasn't running. Obviously, here we just leave everything as it is, press Next. And in here, you can see failover clustering. Go ahead and select that. We get all the details about what's going to be installed. Press Next, press Restart when it's done, and then press Install. Correct. So this step that I just showed you that we did on SQL A will also be needed to be run on SQL B as well. So we'll go ahead and just skip the SQL B installation part, and I'll come back when we're ready to start setting up the cluster. Okay, so we have failover clustering installed. So the next step is to actually configure it. As you can see, I've got SQL A and SQL B set up, and if I go into Windows Administrative Tools, I should have failover clustering on both SQL A as well as SQL B. So let me just go ahead and show you both of them. Right, now it doesn't really matter on which one you do it, because clustering basically just means that both are treated like they're one and the same thing. So just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to go ahead and use failover cluster A as the place where I'm setting it up. You only need to do it in one place. You don't need to do it in both. And as a first step, what we do typically is we validate the configuration. Now in my case, obviously I'm using a virtual machine. It's not going to be perfect, but it will still create a cluster. So the first thing I want to do is log into my, oh yeah, I forgot, I should have actually okay, so when you're creating a failover cluster, obviously you want to add stuff to your domain, right? Which is why when you're logging in, you want to log in using an account that is a domain account. So I logged in using the local administrator, which obviously isn't a good idea because the local administrator is administrator to locally this machine. I want an administrator that can add entries into Active Directory. So I'm just going to go ahead and restart and log in as the domain account that we created previously. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do that on both machines over here. Just give me a second. Restart. Yeah. There we go. I'm going to press Ctrl Alt Delete and this time use another user, and I'm going to sign into, as you can see here, I'll just say SQL 2025 lab slash SQL.dba. And log in using the domain DBA account, and I need to repeat this exercise here as well, so let me just go ahead and do that. Change the account. Oh, okay, looks like I haven't added this guy to the domain yet, SQL B, so let me just go ahead and do that real quick. Okay, don't see. Okay, advanced system settings over here, computer change, and make it part of SQL 2025 lab.com. Press next, type in the administrator account details. I should get a message that says welcome to SQL Lab 2025, all done, and then naturally I need to restart this now. So I'm just going to go ahead and restart it. This guy, I don't need to restart anything because I'm just logged in now directly as the SQL 2025 DBA account. You can see that over here. So in here I can just come in directly and click failover cluster manager. I would need the other guy to come up online because I need to add him into the cluster later on. But as you can see, it's restarted. So I'll just say another user, and I will say SQL 2025 lab slash SQL.dba, and I will say password. Now, one thing that you can do over here is that this account that we just created is not necessarily an admin on both of these machines, but if you want to add him as a built-in administrator to other machines, you can just go ahead and automatically, like any machine that you log into, you would be administrator. Then what you would want to do is just come in here, go to Active Directory, computers, and users, right? And here we have enterprise admins, right? So basically what enterprise admin means, as it's pretty obvious, it's an administrator account for everything in this enterprise, right? So anything, any asset that you might have over here, you're automatically an admin for it, right? So let me just go ahead, click find now, select this guy and press OK. Yeah. So I'm gonna remove the first guy and add the second guy. Right, so automatically he's now an administrator, right? So that's all good, and what we want to do is come back and now start setting up our cluster. So just a second, let me go ahead and set up the cluster. Now in here, the first thing we want to do is validate the configuration, so let's go ahead and do that. Click find, click browse, click advanced, click find now, find our two instances that we're interested in, select them, press OK. You can see here it's detected both SQL A and SQL B. Press next. The domain name should show up automatically. Press next, and you can see here run all test recommended, so I'm just going to do that. But what you want to keep in mind is that when you do run all test, it's going to test for a lot of configurations that you may not be using. So in that case, you need to evaluate whether it's a prerequisite that's absolutely mandatory for what you're doing, or whether it's something that you can skip. Now, if it is something that can be skipped, you will actually get a message saying that some tests failed, but it will still support a cluster. And that's what we would be looking for, because again, this is a virtual environment. This is a lab that I'm setting up for my own testing purposes. So a lot of the stuff that would be considered best practices in a production environment do not exist in this lab setup as it is right now. And the goal here is only to set up a cluster so that I can test the functionality for always on in SQL 2025. And with that in mind, you can see that it's basically doing tests. It'll say if the test passed or if it's not applicable, etc. We want either the test to pass or be not applicable, and if it fails, obviously then we won't be able to set up a cluster, but hopefully there won't be anything that fails since we've already done the Windows update, and the cluster should be created. But let's see what happens. It takes a few minutes because it's testing on both SQL A and SQL B. As I mentioned earlier, you don't need to do this on both machines. You just need to do it on one of them. It's going to go ahead and test on both and make sure that everything is set up correctly. So when you're setting up a cluster, you're just basically doing all your work on one machine. There we go. Almost done. Just a few more tests, I guess, further down. So you can see here it says that the test has completed. To confirm that your cluster is supported, you must run all tests, a cluster, blah, 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 blah. If you run all clusters, da, 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 right? So it says that the validation succeeded, right? The cluster solution is supported by Microsoft if you run a test and all tests succeed, correct? And I don't see any failures here. It's just basically just saying validated or not applicable. So I think we should be good to go. And I can just check this box that says create cluster now using validated nodes, which means that now I can move on to the next step, which is the step of actually creating the cluster. So I'll press next over here, and I have to give my cluster a name. So I'm going to call it SQL Lab, right? And that's going to be kind of like the name that you can use to refer to this cluster and all the nodes in it. And you can see some basic details are over here in terms of like what IP address and what cluster name, etc. will be provided. And as you can see, it also identifies the nodes and says it'll add these nodes into the cluster. So that should be pretty straightforward. It'll take a minute, but once it's done, we should be ready for the next step. Yes, so you can see here, successfully created the cluster using the wizard. And now that the cluster has been successfully created, you can see here I've got a cluster called SQL Lab. Right, it is online, and if I click nodes, I'll have two nodes, both of whom are up, and you can see that the current node setup is like this, where it's got like even numbers, right? So this is not really an ideal way of doing it, because if you have even numbers, we'll face a situation where if one goes down, you'll get something called a split brain, right? So I'll not get into details over here, but you can see that you can see there's a error over here saying that the cluster name was not registered with the DNS, and that basically means that after we created this cluster, there is supposed to be this imaginary computer called SQL Lab, and that SQL Lab entry should have been added here under Windows Administrative Tools, under Active Directory and Computers. SQL Lab should have been added here, and you can see it's added over here. So I think we're good on that front. I don't know why this error is still showing up. Maybe it showed up because of some other issue. Right, so you can see here again it says the cluster name failed registration with one more associated DNS name servers. Okay, should be fine from what I can see. We've got nodes. The only thing that we need to do now is set up something called Quorum. Right, so the idea here is that when we set up the cluster, we want to make sure that we don't have an issue with split brain, right? So if it's an even number, it can be 50-50, but if it's an odd number, it'll never be 50-50. It'll always be 1 out of 3, 2 out of 3, 3 out of 3, etc. And that's why we want to go ahead and configure cluster quorum settings that you see over here, right? So I'll go ahead and click cluster quorum, and what we're basically saying is that we're giving everybody a vote, and we're giving at least 3 people a vote so that they can then decide between themselves who is down and who is up. Right now, ideally you want to spread the vote across independent systems so that they are not affected by the same network outage or the same hardware outage or the same patch outage, etc. Right, so in this case, as you can see here, I'm just going to use select the quorum witness. Right, you can see there is a default one. If you have an additional Windows node, then that will be used as the default, but I'm going to use select quorum witness. And here, as you can see, it says create a disk witness, create a file share witness, or create a cloud witness. I'm going to use a file share witness because it's very easy to set up. A disk is basically what you would call your Quorum Drive. I'm not going to set up a disk because again it's just a Hyper-V VMware virtual machine, right? So I'll click a file share, and I'll need to navigate and create a public file share over here. So I'm going to create my file share, like I mentioned, on an independent machine. So on the Active Directory, I'm just going to create a file share. I'm going to call it Q Drive. Right. Properties, sharing, share, find people. Might as well just make it everyone, right? Yeah. Make it read write. The reason I'm making it read write with share with everyone is because I will have installer files that I need to move around when I'm installing SQL and when I'm installing SSMS, etc. So at that point, I don't want to create another file share and stuff. So I'm just going to make this the default for all of these file transfer that I'm doing. Okay, so there we go. Click browse. Right, and I guess on my Active Directory, Q Drive, and then next, and finish. Right, so now you can see here there is also a quorum, a file share witness that has been added. And in here, what I would typically be doing is there are some additional steps that we would normally do. As you can see, there is a vote here for this guy, there is a vote here for this guy. So they're able to go ahead and decide when to fail over to each other depending on outages and things like that. Right. So at this point, I've got my basic cluster set up. I'm not going to do anything else at the moment. I'm just going to leave the cluster as it is, and I'm going to go ahead and now start my installation process of SQL Server. And hopefully I will be able to create some errors and bugs and situations and then start troubleshooting them to find out like which configuration went wrong or what needs to be done in order to rectify the issue. Right. And that's the purpose of this whole lab in the first place, to install stuff, break it, and try and troubleshoot and identify what needs to be fixed in order to get everything back up and running. At this point, this is your standard cluster. It doesn't really matter. At this point, you can install SQL, SharePoint, anything. The idea is that these nodes will now fail over with each other depending on the resource. And the resource that we want is obviously SQL Server. So that's what I'm going to move on to next.